The streets of South Philadelphia, dimly lit by the flickering glow of street lamps, are eerily quiet as Rocco Bellarosa steps from the shadows. It is late, the world around him seemingly still, but in his mind, the noise of whispers, threats, and betrayals are deafening. His gaze sweeps the darkened alleyways, his eyes sharp, his posture tense. To an outsider, Rocco seems just another man walking through the night. But to anyone who has learned to watch closely, it is clear he is something more, a predator, a figure who sees everything but reveals nothing. His nickname, the Watchful, is no mere moniker, it is a reflection of his entire existence, a life lived with one eye always open. There is an unsettling calm to Rocco Bellarosa, a quiet that belies the chaos within. The Mafia, with its brutal rules and unforgiving power struggles, was not just a career for him. It was a world of constant danger, not only from enemies but from those who once called him ally. It was a world where betrayal was a whispered promise behind every handshake, where trust was currency and suspicion was king. To survive in this world, one had to be vigilant, hyper-aware of every move, every word, every shadow. Rocco's rise to power was not the usual story of a street-smart kid from the wrong side of town who fought his way to the top with bravado and violence. No, his rise was quieter, more subtle. Rocco learned early on that in the world of organized crime, being loud and flashy would get you noticed, and not always in the way you wanted. Power, he realized, was best achieved through control, through remaining unseen, unnoticed. But this calm demeanor came at a cost. For Rocco, control was everything, and control could only be maintained by watching, and by never truly trusting. It was a world of shadows, where the very men who promised loyalty could turn their backs in a moment of weakness. It was a world where everyone was out for themselves, where the line between friend and foe was often impossible to distinguish. And yet, Rocco thrived. He thrived because he watched. He watched with the eyes of a hawk, seeing what others missed, hearing what others ignored. While his enemies made bold moves, Rocco moved in the silence, his presence barely felt, but his influence undeniable. He had learned that survival was not about making noise, but about being able to hear the faintest sound before it became a threat. The city of Philadelphia in the 1980s was a battleground for power, with the Italian Mafia at the heart of it all. Philly wasn't New York, where towering empires of crime were built with brazen force. No, Philadelphia was more intricate, more layered. It was a city of whispers, of networks built on trust and fear. The Mafia families in Philadelphia didn't just control businesses, they controlled lives. They ran numbers, casinos, and protection rackets, but they also ran the streets themselves. Every corner was a possible crossroads between loyalty and treachery. And in the center of it all, in the undercurrent that connected these powerful forces, was Rocco Bellarosa. While other mob bosses might have reveled in their dominance, Rocco's sense of control came from a deep-seated paranoia that never allowed him to feel safe. He trusted no one, not fully. Every smile, every gesture, every word could be a sign of betrayal. It wasn't just the cops or rival families that he feared, it was the very men in his own crew who might decide that their loyalty was no longer worth the price. He lived in a world where the walls had ears and every phone call could be a trap. In many ways, Rocco's paranoia became his greatest strength, for it kept him vigilant, kept him always thinking one step ahead of those who would seek to do him harm. And yet, this same paranoia began to consume him. As Rocco ascended in the Mafia ranks, his need for control tightened. The more power he gained, the more isolation crept into his life. Where once there was a network of allies, there was now a fortress of suspicion. His inner circle shrank. He couldn't afford to trust anyone completely. Even those closest to him, those who had fought beside him for years, became threats in his eyes. It was a burden that only someone like Rocco, who understood the dangerous dance of loyalty and betrayal, could bear. But it wasn't a burden that could be carried forever. In the Mafia world, power is fleeting. The most dangerous men are those who seek to control everything, but in doing so, they often lose sight of the very things that made them strong. Rocco's rise to power wasn't just about strategy or violence, it was about perception. He knew that in the criminal underworld, perception was reality. If you could make others believe you were untouchable, you could achieve the kind of control that mattered. But as Rocco would come to learn, the higher you climb, the further the fall. His grip on Philadelphia was solid, but it was slipping, bit by bit, as his own fears and suspicions gnawed at him. Through it all, he remained the same, a man of few words, a man who watched, a man who saw what others missed. His life was one long series of calculated moves, where every glance, every word, every step was part of the plan. But plans are fragile, especially in a world as unpredictable as the Mafia. The very thing that kept Rocco alive, his watchfulness, was also the thing that slowly started to unravel him. His grip on power was slowly eroded by the very paranoia that had once made him so dangerous. And in the end, it wasn't his enemies that would bring him down. It was his own mind, constantly at war with itself, constantly searching for threats that weren't there. The question that lingered, though, was simple: how did it all come to this? How did Rocco Bellarosa, the once untouchable Don of Philadelphia, end up a man hunted not just by his enemies, but by his own fears? This is the story of Rocco Bellarosa, a story of power, of trust, of paranoia, and of the price one man paid to live in the shadows. The grip of Rocco Bellarosa's legacy over Philadelphia would not soon fade, but the story of his rise and fall would become a haunting tale told in whispers. Those who had known him remembered a man who always kept watch, a man who never allowed his guard to slip. And even now, as the city moves on, his shadow lingers, silent, unseen, but always watching. Rocco Bellarosa's early life in South Philadelphia was a mix of hard lessons, family ties, and a world that offered little in terms of opportunity. Born to Italian immigrants in the 1930s, his family lived in a neighborhood where survival often meant navigating a fine line between respect and fear. The streets were filled with the kind of toughness that hardened the hearts of young boys, where every corner seemed to hold a promise of something more, a promise of power, respect, and loyalty, but also of danger, violence, and deceit. As a child, Rocco had seen it all: the uncles and cousins who seemed to always be involved in something shady, the men who spoke in low voices, their conversations veiled in secrecy. His parents worked hard to keep food on the table, and though they tried to shelter Rocco from the harsh realities around him, he could not escape the magnetic pull of the underworld that surrounded him. In his neighborhood, the Mafia was more than a force, it was a presence, like a shadow that stretched across every street, every block, every family. It was whispered about in the homes of his friends, mentioned with a mix of awe and fear. For Rocco, the Mafia wasn't just a distant world, it was part of his everyday life, inescapable and intoxicating. By the time he was a teenager, Rocco began to notice the little things that separated the men of the Mafia from the other men in the neighborhood. The way they carried themselves with an air of quiet confidence, as if they didn't need to announce their power to be feared. The way they seemed to know everything, every rumor, every secret, every deal happening in the shadows of the city. Rocco was an observer by nature, always watching, always listening. He was quiet, reserved, and though he didn't say much, he understood a great deal. He began to understand that in this world, silence was a weapon. In the early 1940s, Philadelphia was a city of hard men and harder streets. The Great Depression had taken its toll on the working class, and for many Italian Americans in the area, the Mafia represented a way out of poverty, a way to gain respect and power. It was in this environment that Rocco's path began to take shape. He wasn't a natural-born criminal, nor was he the kind of person who had a thirst for violence. But he saw the allure of the Mafia life, the way it gave men a sense of purpose, a sense of control. And for a young boy growing up in a rough neighborhood, there was something undeniable about the power it offered. Rocco's first taste of the criminal world came through his interactions with the older men who hung around the corners of South Philadelphia. These were men who had already made their names in the Mafia, men who were respected, feared, and always well-connected. At first, Rocco just ran errands for them, small jobs that kept him out of trouble but allowed him to start forming connections. He was a quiet observer, a listener, and he quickly became known as someone who could be relied upon for discretion. In this world, trust was everything, and Rocco had a natural ability to keep his mouth shut and his eyes open. As he grew older, Rocco began to get involved in more serious activities. Small-time jobs led to larger ones, and before long, he was trusted with handling money, making deliveries, and overseeing operations that required a level of discretion and attention to detail that few others could match. By his early 20s, Rocco had become an important figure in the local mafia, not because he was particularly ruthless or flashy, but because he was methodical, cautious, and above all, reliable. He never drew attention to himself, and this quiet approach earned him respect among the more seasoned mobsters. But it wasn't just his calm demeanor that set him apart, it was his ability to read people. Rocco had an uncanny ability to understand the motivations of others, to see through the facades that people put up. This skill served him well in the criminal world, where everyone had their own agenda, their own plans, and their own secrets. Rocco learned early on that the most dangerous people were often the ones who kept their emotions hidden, the ones who didn't speak much, but who were always observing, always calculating. As Rocco's involvement in the mafia deepened, so did his understanding of the dangers that came with the life he had chosen. He had seen men who trusted the wrong people, men who were too quick to act, men who let their egos get in the way of their survival. In a world where betrayal was common and loyalty was often tested, Rocco learned to trust only a select few, and even then, only when he had no other choice. The more he saw, the more he realized how precarious the balance of power was in the mafia. One wrong move, one wrong word, could mean the end. Rocco's entry into the world of organized crime wasn't marked by a single dramatic event, but rather by a series of small steps, each one leading him further into the depths of a world he would never be able to leave. It was a world of shadows and whispers, where the rules were clear but often unspoken. The mafia wasn't just about money or power, it was about survival. And for someone like Rocco, who valued control above all else, it was the perfect world to sink his teeth into. His upbringing had taught him that the world was dangerous and unpredictable, and in the mafia, he found a place where he could carve out his own space, a place where his natural caution and attention to detail would be assets. In many ways, Rocco was born for this life. While other young men might have sought fame or fortune, Rocco was more concerned with securing his place, maintaining his position, and never drawing attention to himself. The quieter he was, the more he could observe, and the more he could control the narrative. As he watched the older men make their moves, he began to learn the rules of the game, rules that were unspoken but understood by those who had been in the game long enough to know better than to make a sound. But even as Rocco adapted to his new life, he couldn't ignore the growing tension around him. The world of organized crime was in a constant state of flux, and every new move made by a rival family or a disgruntled ally could shake the delicate balance that held everything together. Rocco understood this better than most. It was not enough to be tough or ruthless. To survive, you had to be smarter than the rest. You had to stay one step ahead, always watching, always calculating. And Rocco did just that. By the time he reached his mid-20s, Rocco had become a fixture in Philadelphia's criminal underworld. His reputation for being reliable, discreet, and observant had earned him a place at the table with some of the most powerful men in the city. But Rocco was never satisfied. He knew that the true power in the mafia was not in the overt acts of violence or the loud displays of dominance. It was in the quiet, strategic moves, those that nobody saw coming. And that was how Rocco Bellarosa would make his mark, not with brute force, but with silent, unyielding control. The path ahead of him seemed clear. There was no turning back now. And in a world where loyalty was as fragile as glass and betrayal was a constant threat, Rocco had one advantage no one could take from him, his ability to watch, to listen, and to wait. In the underworld, that was all it took to survive. And Rocco Bellarosa was nothing if not a survivor. Rocco's early years in the mafia were marked by subtle, yet significant steps, each one a calculated decision that would ultimately propel him further into the underworld. As a young man, he didn't rush into crime with the bravado of some of his peers. He didn't seek fame, or even riches. Instead, Rocco had a quiet determination, understanding that the path to power was not necessarily a straight line but a series of well-timed moves, each one designed to put him closer to his goal without drawing too much attention. His first major break came when he was introduced to the larger, more powerful members of the Philadelphia Mafia. The local family was run by seasoned men who had survived decades of shifting alliances, political maneuvering, and bloody turf wars. These were men who didn't trust easily, men whose loyalty was hard-earned and, even then, often given with caution. But Rocco's reputation for discretion had already begun to spread. He was known for being reliable, for not asking questions, and for never being in a hurry to move up. These were the qualities that mattered to the mafia bosses, qualities that made Rocco a safe bet when it came to handling delicate situations. He didn't start with the big jobs. Instead, he was given small but important tasks, jobs that required an attention to detail and a deep understanding of the people around him. Rocco would run errands for the family, moving money, making deliveries, and gathering information. At first, it seemed like little more than busy work, but in reality, each task was a lesson, each mission a chance to prove his worth. Over time, he began to see the bigger picture, the web of relationships and favors that held the mafia together. His ability to listen, to watch, and to understand these complex dynamics made him valuable, and slowly, his responsibilities began to grow. The first major turning point in Rocco's career came when he was asked to handle a delicate negotiation between two rival factions. The deal was high stakes, involving a large sum of money and the control of a lucrative part of the city's underworld. It was a risky move, but Rocco's calm demeanor and reputation for keeping his word made him the perfect candidate for the job. He wasn't the one pulling the strings, but his role as the intermediary gave him a unique position. He was trusted by both sides, yet loyal to neither. It was a delicate balance that few men could maintain, but Rocco managed it with ease. The negotiation was tense. The air in the room was thick with suspicion, and every word spoken seemed loaded with meaning. Rocco remained calm throughout, his eyes flicking from one side to the other, always aware of the smallest shifts in body language, the faintest hint of a lie. He didn't speak much, he didn't need to. His presence alone, his ability to remain impartial, was enough to earn the respect of both sides. The deal went through without incident, and Rocco had proven himself to be not just reliable, but indispensable. From that point on, he became a trusted member of the inner circle, often called upon for more sensitive and high-level operations. But the rise wasn't without its dangers. As Rocco moved deeper into the mafia, he began to see the darker side of the business. He witnessed firsthand the ruthlessness that it took to maintain control, the sacrifices that had to be made to ensure survival. It wasn't just about loyalty, it was about power, and in the world of organized crime, power meant control over everything, money, territory, and, most importantly, people. The more Rocco observed, the more he began to understand the underlying code that governed the mafia world. Loyalty was paramount, but loyalty could be a double-edged sword. A man who owed you loyalty could just as easily become your biggest threat if his interests changed or if he saw a way to climb higher. Rocco learned early that in the mafia, trust was a currency, valuable but often short-lived. He also learned that the most dangerous man was the one who had nothing left to lose, the one who was willing to do anything to gain more. It was during this time that Rocco's growing paranoia began to take shape. He had always been a naturally cautious man, but the more involved he became in the mafia, the more he realized just how tenuous his position was. No one in the mafia could ever be completely trusted. Even those closest to you could turn on you in an instant if they saw an opportunity to gain favor with someone higher up. In the world of organized crime, there were no guarantees. To survive, Rocco understood, he had to stay ahead of the game. He couldn't afford to be careless, couldn't afford to trust anyone too easily. This growing sense of caution would eventually become his greatest strength, but it also began to isolate him. Rocco's increasing wariness of others, his desire to control every situation, created a distance between him and his fellow mobsters. The more he watched, the less he spoke, and the less he spoke, the more people began to notice. But Rocco wasn't worried. He knew that in the long run, being underestimated could be just as powerful as being feared. As his influence within the family grew, Rocco became more involved in the financial side of the operations. He helped manage the money flowing through the family, making sure that it was distributed wisely and that no one was skimming off the top. He was a man who understood the importance of money, not just as a tool for power, but as a means of survival. The more he learned about the family's finances, the more he realized how precarious their situation truly was. The mafia wasn't as invincible as it seemed. The money, the territory, the respect, it was all built on a fragile foundation, and one misstep could bring it all crashing down. Rocco's rise was slow, but steady. He wasn't flashy, he didn't make a lot of noise, and he certainly didn't seek attention. He simply did the work that needed to be done and did it well. His growing reputation as a man who could be trusted to handle even the most sensitive of operations earned him the respect of the family's leadership. But as he moved up the ranks, Rocco began to realize that his greatest asset, his ability to stay calm under pressure, was also his greatest curse. The more control he exerted over the family's operations, the more it became clear that Rocco wasn't just managing people and money, he was managing his own fate. The higher you rise, the harder you fall. Soon, he would be faced with decisions that would challenge his carefully constructed world. But for now, Rocco Bellarosa was in his element. He had earned his place in the underworld, and he was playing the game better than anyone else. It was only a matter of time before his ambitions would push him to claim more, but for the moment, Rocco was content to let others believe that he was just another cog in the machine. The real power, he knew, lay in staying unnoticed, until the moment was right to strike. As Rocco's reputation solidified within the Philadelphia Mafia, he found himself entrusted with increasingly important tasks. However, these responsibilities came with a price, a constant weight of tension, of unseen eyes watching, of whispers in the shadows. The Mafia world, though built on loyalty, was ever-changing, and Rocco understood that he was always one step away from being pulled into a conflict he had no desire to be part of. Yet, he couldn't escape it. The deeper he went, the more the underworld's complexities tangled with his life. Rocco's skill in maintaining the delicate balance between discretion and authority made him a natural choice when the family needed someone to handle more intricate situations. He wasn't flashy, but his quiet efficiency made him invaluable to the upper echelons of the organization. The family wasn't a tight-knit group of friends, it was a machine, an operation that depended on each cog working in harmony. And Rocco had become one of those cogs, a man who knew how to keep things running smoothly without ever drawing too much attention to himself. It was during this time that Rocco's influence began to grow, though in subtle ways. He was increasingly involved in the family's key operations, moving money, managing resources, and even overseeing territory disputes that could quickly escalate into violence. But he didn't handle these situations with the brute force that many of his colleagues used. Instead, he relied on his calm demeanor and ability to read people. Rocco knew that while violence was often a necessary tool in the world of organized crime, there was a far more effective method: manipulation. If you could control people, if you could understand their motivations, you could often achieve the same results without having to lift a finger. One of the first significant moments where Rocco's understanding of people's weaknesses came into play occurred when a rival faction attempted to muscle in on the Bellarosa family's territory. The confrontation began with small, seemingly insignificant incidents, a few unspoken slights, a slight increase in tension at the neighborhood level, but it escalated quickly. The rival family, led by a brash and ambitious capo, thought they could take control without inciting full-scale conflict. Rocco knew better. He had seen these things before. The issue wasn't just about territory, it was about pride, and pride in the mafia could lead to fatal decisions. Rather than responding immediately with force, as many of the family's other men would have, Rocco took a different approach. He started by meeting with the rival faction's lieutenants, getting a feel for their ambitions and their vulnerabilities. He took note of who was loyal, who was easily manipulated, and who held real power. It wasn't long before he discovered cracks in the other family's unity. There were personal grudges, old debts, and even a few whispers of betrayal within their ranks. Rocco bided his time. He played the long game, sending word through his own network of informants and contacts that the rival family was struggling with its internal issues. He carefully orchestrated a series of subtle moves that fed into the growing discord within the rival faction. What had started as a small territorial dispute began to unravel from the inside out, with members of the rival family becoming suspicious of each other. Eventually, they started making mistakes, miscalculations, missteps, that Rocco had quietly engineered. By the time the rival family realized what had happened, it was too late. Rocco had not only preserved the Bellarosa family's territory, but he had also weakened the rival faction significantly, leaving them vulnerable to a well-timed push by his family. Without ever lifting a finger, Rocco had achieved a victory. He had used the oldest weapon in the mafia's arsenal, the manipulation of human nature. But this victory, as satisfying as it was, didn't go unnoticed. The higher-ups in the family began to see Rocco not just as a reliable operator, but as a force to be reckoned with. His ability to outmaneuver rivals without the need for violence earned him a kind of respect that most men in the mafia couldn't achieve. For all their talk of loyalty and honor, the mafia, at its core, was about survival, and Rocco was proving himself to be a master of it. As the months passed, however, Rocco began to feel the weight of his growing influence. Though he had avoided drawing too much attention to himself, he couldn't escape the fact that he was becoming more involved in the decisions that mattered. There were more whispers, more rumors, and more eyes trained on him. The mafia, by nature, was a place where power struggles were constant. And in a world where even the slightest misstep could cost a man his life, Rocco had to be more careful than ever. It was around this time that Rocco's paranoia began to take root. He had always been cautious, always measured his steps, but now, every move seemed to carry an additional layer of danger. He started to see threats where others didn't. A handshake could be a warning, a smile could be a betrayal. The people around him, once allies, now seemed to him like potential enemies. Every conversation was a chess match, every look a potential challenge. Rocco's ability to read people had always been his greatest strength, but now, it was starting to feel like a curse. He could see everyone's motives, but that knowledge only made him more wary, more isolated. This growing sense of paranoia was compounded by the changing dynamics of the mafia. The old guard, the men who had built the Bellarosa family from the ground up, were beginning to age, and a new generation of mobsters was coming into power. These men were brash, eager, and often reckless. They were ambitious in ways that Rocco could never fully embrace. The world of the mafia was evolving, and Rocco found himself questioning whether he was still playing the same game. The rising tensions between the younger and older factions were becoming harder to ignore. But Rocco remained focused. His goal had always been to secure his place in the family, to maintain control over his own destiny. He didn't care about the limelight, he cared about survival. And he knew that in this world, survival meant staying ahead of the game. He wasn't interested in being a flashy figurehead, a man whose name was known to everyone. Instead, Rocco preferred to be the man behind the scenes, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly without anyone ever knowing how. That was where the true power lay. Still, the mafia was a world full of shadows and half-truths. Every day, Rocco walked a tightrope, careful not to let his paranoia show, but never quite able to shake the sense that danger was always lurking just around the corner. The mafia was a world of betrayal, and even the most cautious men could find themselves swept up in it if they weren't careful. In the weeks that followed, Rocco continued to solidify his position within the family, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to change. The old guard was weakening, and with them, the stability of the family itself. For the first time, Rocco realized that even he wasn't immune to the chaos that came with the mafia life. And though he had managed to stay one step ahead for so long, he knew that the world he had built was as fragile as any other, and that it was only a matter of time before it started to crack. Rocco's success in navigating the delicate balance of power within the family did not come without its complications. As his influence grew, so did the weight of his decisions. In the shadows of the Philadelphia underworld, where every gesture and word carried meaning, Rocco became more aware of the risks that came with his rising stature. It was a game of survival, and to survive, he needed to stay one step ahead, not only of his rivals but also of his allies, whose ambitions often went unspoken but were always simmering beneath the surface. The first real test of Rocco's authority came when the family found itself in the middle of a power struggle. A new player had entered the scene, a young, ambitious capo from out of town who believed that his rise to power could be achieved by any means necessary. His name was Tony, the Shark, Mariani, and from the moment he stepped into the family's operations, it was clear that he wasn't interested in sharing power. He wanted control. At first, Rocco thought little of Mariani. He was just another loudmouth with a knack for causing trouble, a man more interested in flexing his muscles than in understanding the intricacies of mafia life. But as time passed, Rocco began to see something in Mariani that troubled him. The young capo had an uncanny ability to manipulate those around him, using charm, threats, and a fierce will to get what he wanted. Mariani wasn't just a loudmouth, he was a calculated threat who knew how to play the game in his own way. The first real clash came when Mariani started pushing for a larger share of the family's operations in South Philly. It was an area of high value, and Mariani had the support of a number of younger, more ambitious members of the family who were eager to see him succeed. Rocco, for his part, wasn't interested in territory wars. He had always preferred the behind-the-scenes management, the quiet distribution of power and resources. But the conflict was brewing, and Rocco knew that ignoring it could lead to disaster. He decided to meet with Mariani, to see if they could reach some sort of understanding before things escalated further. Rocco was no stranger to negotiations, and he knew how to read a man's intentions. Mariani, however, was a different breed. He wasn't content to simply negotiate, he saw every conversation as a battlefield, every handshake as a challenge. The meeting was tense, a subtle dance of words, with both men testing the waters, trying to gauge the other's strength. Rocco's approach was calm, controlled. He spoke in measured tones, making it clear that he wasn't there to fight, but rather to preserve the peace. Mariani, on the other hand, was aggressive. He didn't care for subtleties, he wanted to take what he thought was his, and he wasn't shy about showing it. He pushed, he threatened, and he made it clear that he wasn't afraid to step over anyone who stood in his way. For the first time in a long time, Rocco felt the pressure mounting. Mariani wasn't backing down, and the young capo's supporters were growing bolder. It became clear that the family was at a crossroads. Rocco knew that if he didn't act, the balance of power would tip in Mariani's favor, and the stability that Rocco had worked so hard to maintain would unravel. The meeting ended with no resolution. But Rocco wasn't the type to back away from a challenge. Instead, he took the time to carefully plan his next move. He began to quietly reach out to the older, more established members of the family, men who had been loyal to the Bellarosa family for decades. He reminded them of their shared history, of the loyalty that had once bound them together. Rocco knew that he had to turn the tide in his favor, and the only way to do that was to make sure that Mariani didn't have the support of the men who truly controlled the family. As the days passed, Rocco's influence grew, and so did his paranoia. He became more watchful, more cautious, aware that every conversation, every action, could have consequences. The deeper he delved into the workings of the family, the more he realized how fragile the web of alliances truly was. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything he had worked for could come crashing down. Rocco's strategy was one of subtlety, and he knew that if he played his cards right, Mariani's own ambitions would be his undoing. It wasn't long before rumors began to spread, rumors that Mariani was overstepping his bounds, that he was too ambitious for his own good. Rocco didn't start these rumors, but he didn't stop them either. He understood the power of whispers, of half-truths and insinuations. He knew that in the world of the mafia, perception was often as powerful as reality. Over the next few weeks, Rocco worked tirelessly to build his alliances, to solidify his position within the family. He met with the old guard, ensuring them that his interests aligned with theirs. He subtly undermined Mariani's credibility, feeding information to those who needed to hear it, carefully sowing the seeds of doubt. Slowly, but surely, Mariani's power began to wane. His supporters, once so confident, started to question their loyalty. The cracks in his leadership grew wider, and Rocco knew that the time to strike was approaching. The final confrontation, when it came, was swift and decisive. Rocco and Mariani met once again, but this time the stakes were much higher. The young capo, having lost much of his support, was no longer the cocky, ambitious man he had once been. He was desperate. His arrogance had cost him the loyalty of his men, and now he was left with few options. Rocco, on the other hand, stood calm, composed, his position secure. The power had shifted, and it was clear that the younger man's time was up. Rocco made it clear to Mariani that he had overplayed his hand. There would be no violent clash, no bloody showdown. Instead, Mariani was given a choice: leave the family or face the consequences. Rocco's ability to outmaneuver his opponent without ever raising his voice, without shedding a drop of blood, was a testament to his skill. In the Mafia, there were many ways to win, and Rocco had found the most effective one: patience, strategy, and the quiet exertion of power. The removal of Mariani marked a turning point for Rocco. He had not only secured his position within the family but had also proven that he was more than just a behind-the-scenes operator, he was a force to be reckoned with. His ability to outthink and outmaneuver his opponents without ever appearing to make a move elevated him to a level of power that few others could understand. But with this newfound power came even greater responsibility. The family's future was now in Rocco's hands, and he would need to continue playing the game carefully if he wanted to maintain his position. Rocco's paranoia, which had been a growing force in his life, continued to deepen. The more power he gained, the more he began to trust no one. Every handshake, every word spoken in the dimly lit corners of the Mafia's world, seemed laced with hidden motives. Rocco had learned to trust his instincts, but even they seemed to betray him at times. The game was changing, and Rocco knew that in the ever-shifting landscape of Mafia politics, one false move could bring everything crashing down. As Rocco continued to consolidate his power within the family, he became acutely aware of the dangers lurking around every corner. While his victory over Mariani had secured his standing in the Bellarosa family, it also marked a critical turning point. The Mafia world was never static, alliances could shift at any moment, and loyalty, once taken for granted, could quickly turn into betrayal. Rocco's paranoia, already a constant companion, deepened with every passing day. The more power he gained, the more he understood how fragile it all was. There were whispers, of course. Whispers that suggested Rocco's rise wasn't entirely his own doing. Some said it was luck, others that he had the right connections, that he had a way of making the right people trust him at just the right moment. But Rocco knew better. He understood that in the Mafia, loyalty was often built on fear, not admiration. And fear, once planted, was not easily eradicated. The men who had once stood by him, applauding his rise, now watched him more closely. Their eyes were full of suspicion, assessing whether his ambition would eventually turn on them. Rocco had always prided himself on his ability to read people, but now, even he felt the weight of the eyes upon him. The Mafia's traditional structure, the respect for hierarchy and age-old codes, had begun to fray at the edges. While the older members still held on to their power with an iron grip, a new generation was slowly emerging, hungry for control, hungry for change. Rocco had witnessed this generational shift firsthand, and it troubled him. The new blood was brash and unpredictable, willing to take risks that the older members would never have dreamed of. This was a different world, one where the old rules no longer applied, and the stakes were higher than ever before. Rocco knew that in order to stay in control, he would need to navigate these shifting tides carefully. The balance of power in the Bellarosa family was delicate, and every decision could tip the scales. He couldn't afford to alienate the older guard, but he also had to ensure that the younger, more ambitious members didn't try to push him aside. He wasn't naive enough to think that loyalty was a permanent fixture in the world of organized crime. In this world, power was fleeting, and alliances were as unstable as the tides. It was around this time that a major opportunity presented itself, one that could either cement Rocco's position or undo everything he had worked for. Word came down from the upper ranks of the family that there was a new business venture on the table, an operation in Atlantic City. Gambling was big business, and the family had the chance to establish a foothold in one of the most lucrative industries of the time. But the venture was risky. The competition was fierce, and the political landscape was unstable. If Rocco could manage it, it would be a massive win for the Bellarosa family. If he failed, however, the fallout would be catastrophic. The decision to take on the Atlantic City venture was not one Rocco took lightly. It required resources, time, and manpower, things that were already stretched thin due to ongoing operations. But Rocco had a knack for reading situations, and he saw an opportunity here that the others might have missed. The potential for profit was undeniable, and more importantly, it would give him the leverage he needed to solidify his position within the family. At first, Rocco's involvement was kept behind the scenes. He didn't want to draw too much attention to himself or to the operation. Instead, he quietly arranged for the necessary resources to be funneled into the project, working with a small team of trusted men. But as the venture began to take shape, so did the risks. There were unexpected hurdles, rivals trying to muscle in, law enforcement breathing down their necks, and internal disagreements about how the operation should be run. Rocco's ability to handle these challenges was tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. One of the first obstacles came when a rival faction from New York, led by an ambitious and well-connected capo named Vito, the Shark, Moretti, started making moves on the Atlantic City territory. Moretti had long been a thorn in the side of the Bellarosa family, but his influence was growing, and his reputation was built on intimidation. He had no qualms about using violence to achieve his goals, and it was clear that he saw the Bellarosa family's new venture as a direct challenge to his own power. Rocco knew that a confrontation with Moretti could spiral out of control quickly. He wasn't interested in a full-scale war, especially over something as volatile as a gambling operation. So, as always, he relied on his ability to outthink his opponents. He started working behind the scenes to neutralize Moretti's support, quietly spreading rumors, offering incentives, and making sure that key players in the New York faction had a reason to think twice about supporting him. It was a subtle approach, but Rocco knew that in the world of organized crime, subtlety often worked better than brute force. But despite his efforts, the tension continued to mount. Moretti's men started to make their presence felt in Atlantic City, disrupting operations and intimidating local businesses. The pressure on Rocco grew, and he could feel the walls closing in. He began to question whether he had made the right decision in taking on the Atlantic City venture at all. There were moments when his paranoia flared, when he wondered if the operation had been a trap all along, designed to pull him into a conflict he couldn't escape. It was during this period of mounting stress that Rocco began to retreat further into himself. He stopped trusting his men as much, pulling away from those who had once been his closest allies. Every conversation, every interaction, felt like a potential threat. The mafia world, which had once seemed like a manageable web of power and influence, now felt like a dangerous, unpredictable game where the rules changed at a moment's notice. The pressure of the Atlantic City venture, combined with his growing distrust of those around him, began to take a toll on Rocco. He started spending more time alone, reflecting on the choices he had made, wondering if the paranoia that had once been his strength had now become his greatest weakness. The operation was teetering on the brink of disaster, and Rocco couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. But then, just as it seemed like everything was about to fall apart, an unexpected turn of events occurred. A key figure in Moretti's operation, someone who had been responsible for coordinating the rival faction's efforts in Atlantic City, was arrested in a sting operation. The arrest was a blow to Moretti's plans, and it sent shockwaves through his network. With one move, Rocco's careful manipulation had dealt a devastating blow to his rival. The arrest was a turning point in the battle for Atlantic City, and it gave Rocco the breathing room he needed to regain control. Though the crisis had passed, Rocco's sense of unease remained. The operation in Atlantic City was now firmly in Bellarosa hands, but the victory felt hollow. He had won the battle, but he knew that the war was far from over. In the world of the Mafia, the only certainty was that things were always changing, always shifting. And Rocco, for all his careful planning and calculated moves, understood that in this world, the only real peace was the kind you could buy with your own survival. The Atlantic City venture, while ultimately a success for Rocco, marked the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that was defined by an even deeper, more consuming paranoia. Rocco's instincts, which had always served him well, now operated in overdrive. The city itself, once a symbol of opportunity, now felt like a maze, a landscape full of hidden dangers that only he could sense. He couldn't escape the feeling that the underworld had its eyes fixed on him, constantly watching, constantly waiting for a mistake. Though he had successfully navigated the challenges posed by Moretti, Rocco couldn't help but wonder whether the victory was truly his. He had learned over the years that in the Mafia world, it was never the victor who truly held power, but the one who remained standing when the dust settled. Moretti, though momentarily sidelined, was still a dangerous figure. Rocco had watched men like him before, ruthless, hungry, and patient. Moretti would wait for the right moment to strike back, and Rocco knew that he couldn't afford to let his guard down. But it wasn't just Moretti that concerned him. The deeper Rocco got into the workings of Atlantic City, the more he realized that the venture was far more complicated than he had anticipated. The city was a hotbed of corruption, with politicians, law enforcement, and business tycoons all playing their part in the game. The Bellarosa family's new operation had quickly become entangled in this web of deceit, and Rocco was beginning to question whether they could truly remain untouched. One evening, as Rocco walked through the quiet, dimly lit streets of the city, his mind began to race. He had just received word that some of the more established politicians who had agreed to cooperate with the family were beginning to backpedal. The promises they had made, the deals they had struck, were being called into question. A growing list of accidents involving those who had opposed the family's interests was starting to gain attention. The more Rocco thought about it, the more he realized how vulnerable they were. He could feel the walls closing in. The money flowing in from the casinos was nothing compared to the political and legal leverage they needed to maintain power. It was then that Rocco made the decision to extend his reach, to get involved in the city's political scene. He had always avoided direct confrontation with politics in the past, preferring to pull the strings from behind the scenes. But now, the stakes were too high. The Bellarosa family couldn't afford to operate like ghosts anymore, they needed a more tangible, more visible presence in the city's corridors of power. Rocco knew he had to act quickly, before they became just another casualty in the city's endless cycle of backroom deals and broken promises. He started making connections with key figures in the local government, working to secure his place in the political landscape. It wasn't an easy task. The political scene in Atlantic City was a web of alliances, each one more fragile than the last. Rocco was careful to keep his distance, speaking only to those he trusted and always maintaining a calm, collected demeanor. He knew that in politics, appearances were everything. To be seen as too eager, too desperate, could make a man a target. Rocco also took the opportunity to strengthen his ties with the law enforcement in the area. He had learned over the years that the police could be either an asset or a liability, depending on how they were handled. He knew that the Bellarosa family needed to have a presence within the police force if they were to continue operating without interference. But he also knew that the cops in Atlantic City were a notoriously slippery bunch. They were easily bought, but their loyalty was fleeting. One wrong move, one corrupt officer exposed, and the entire operation could crumble. As Rocco worked to solidify these new alliances, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in around him. His every move seemed to be scrutinized, every conversation was laced with hidden meaning. The paranoia that had once been a subtle, almost subconscious force now consumed him entirely. He trusted no one, not even his closest associates. Every word spoken, every glance exchanged felt like it held a hidden agenda. Even the most mundane interactions became suspect, as if there were a secret code that only Rocco could decipher. He started pulling back, isolating himself from those who had once been his allies. This new behavior didn't go unnoticed. Some of the older members of the family began to whisper among themselves. Rocco's rise had been swift, but it had also been marked by a cold, calculating detachment. He was no longer the charming, charismatic figure he once was. Instead, he had become something else entirely, an enigma, a man whose mind was constantly at war with itself. Some of his men began to question whether his newfound approach was a sign of strength or weakness. The more Rocco retreated into himself, the more distant he became, and with distance came doubt. Yet, despite his growing isolation, Rocco knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He had always understood that the mafia world was a game of chess, where every move mattered. It wasn't just about muscle or intimidation, it was about strategy, about thinking several steps ahead. Rocco knew that, even as he struggled with his own sense of mistrust, the game was still being played. The other families were still watching, still waiting for an opportunity to make their move. He had to remain vigilant, and he couldn't afford to show any weakness. But as the months went by, Rocco began to feel the toll of the constant vigilance. The pressure of balancing so many moving parts, the gambling operations, the political connections, the law enforcement ties, was wearing him thin. He had always prided himself on his ability to control the chaos around him, but now the chaos was starting to consume him. His paranoia had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more he isolated himself, the more the world around him seemed to close in. His mind was no longer clear, it was clouded with doubt, fear, and suspicion. In private moments, Rocco would sometimes reflect on the man he had become. He had started his journey in the streets, a man of ambition and hunger. But somewhere along the way, he had lost something, his ability to trust, his connection to the people who had helped him rise. He knew that if he didn't regain some semblance of control, he would lose everything. But the more he tried to exert that control, the further it seemed to slip from his grasp. And so, Rocco found himself at a crossroads. He had built an empire, but it was an empire built on shifting sands. He couldn't rely on the loyalty of his men, the stability of his operations, or even his own judgment. The paranoia that had once kept him sharp was now his greatest enemy. He knew that he had to confront the demons that were plaguing him, or they would eventually bring him down. But how? How could he regain control in a world that seemed determined to slip through his fingers? The question hung in the air, unanswered. For Rocco, the answers were never simple, and in the mafia world, there was never a clear path forward. Every choice was fraught with risk, every decision had consequences. The empire he had built was crumbling, but whether it was the result of external forces or his own fractured mind, he couldn't say. But as he sat alone in his office late one night, staring at the city lights in the distance, he realized that the time for reflection was over. He couldn't afford to wait for clarity anymore. The only thing that mattered now was survival. And in the mafia world, survival meant one thing above all else, taking action, no matter the cost. The events of the past months had left Rocco feeling unmoored, like a ship caught in a storm with no safe harbor in sight. The Atlantic City operation, while successful, had come at a cost he hadn't anticipated. The constant pressure of maintaining control over the city's sprawling underworld had begun to chip away at him, leaving him more paranoid and less able to trust anyone, even those who had been by his side for years. At the core of Rocco's anxiety was a nagging feeling that his enemies were closing in. He had taken the necessary steps to eliminate rivals, neutralize political threats, and manipulate law enforcement. But there were always cracks in the armor. The higher he climbed, the more fragile his position seemed to become. It wasn't just the competition from other mafia families that worried him, it was the slow, insidious erosion of loyalty within his own ranks. There were murmurs among the men in his crew, whispers of doubt and discontent that Rocco could feel but couldn't fully grasp. He had always prided himself on being a master of reading people, but now the faces around him seemed to blur, their intentions hidden behind masks of politeness and false camaraderie. Even the most trusted members of his inner circle, those who had helped him build his empire, were starting to distance themselves, unsure of his mental state and increasingly erratic behavior. Rocco's instincts, once so sharp, now seemed clouded by his own paranoia. He had always relied on his ability to see through people, to spot betrayal before it took root, but the more he suspected treachery, the more isolated he became. Every conversation felt like a test, every meeting an interrogation. He no longer trusted the men who came to him with news or reports. They all had an agenda, or so he thought. The tension came to a head one evening when one of his most loyal lieutenants, Tony, the Wolf DeMarco, came to him with troubling news. Tony, a burly, no-nonsense kind of guy who had been with Rocco since the early days, had always been the voice of reason in the family. But tonight, his demeanor was different. He was nervous, pacing back and forth in Rocco's office, not meeting his eyes. "Rocco," Tony began, his voice tight, "there's something you need to know. It's about the operation in Atlantic City." Rocco felt a chill run down his spine. Tony's hesitation was enough to set off alarm bells. He gestured for Tony to continue, trying to hide the unease that was spreading inside him. "What's going on, Tony?" Rocco's voice was steady, but his heart was pounding in his chest. Tony stopped pacing and finally looked at him, his eyes filled with unease. "There are rumors. Some of the men from Jersey, they're talking. They're saying that the operation's getting too big. That it's starting to attract too much attention. They're saying it's putting the whole family at risk." Rocco felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He had expected the usual chatter, the usual worries. But something about Tony's words struck a nerve. He stood up from his chair and walked over to the window, staring out at the dark city streets below. The weight of the family's entire operation rested on his shoulders, and the constant strain was beginning to show. "Are you telling me that we're on the verge of losing control?" Rocco's voice was low, his tone cold. He turned to face Tony, his eyes narrowing. "This is how it starts, Tony. This is how men start to fall. They get nervous, they talk. They start questioning their loyalty. But I don't want to hear about rumors. I want facts." Tony swallowed hard, and Rocco could see the unease in his eyes. "There's a lot of talk, Rocco. And I don't know what to believe. But I think you need to act fast. If you wait too long, it might be too late." Rocco's mind raced. He had heard the same kind of whispers before, rumors about infighting, betrayal, and ambition. He had always managed to silence them quickly, using force or manipulation to keep things under control. But this time, the words felt different. There was something in Tony's voice that made Rocco realize that this wasn't just idle chatter. Something was wrong, and it was bigger than he had anticipated. He paced the room, trying to organize his thoughts. His paranoia, which had once been his greatest asset, was now a double-edged sword. He didn't know who he could trust anymore. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every face a potential enemy. His mind raced, jumping from one possibility to the next, trying to figure out the best course of action. Then, suddenly, it hit him, he needed to take control. He couldn't afford to sit back and wait for things to fall apart. The family needed to see that he was still in charge. They needed to know that he wasn't afraid to make hard decisions, even if it meant making enemies out of his closest allies. Rocco turned back to Tony, his expression hardening. "Set up a meeting with the other capos," he ordered. "Get them all in the same room. We're going to talk about this, and we're going to make sure that no one steps out of line. If there's a problem, we fix it. If someone's loyal, they stay. If they're not, they're gone." Tony nodded, his face pale but resolute. "I'll take care of it, Rocco." As Tony left the room, Rocco couldn't shake the feeling that he had just sealed his own fate. He knew what this meeting would mean: there would be no more subtlety, no more quiet negotiations. The cracks in his empire were starting to show, and he was about to find out just how deep they ran. It wasn't just about maintaining power anymore, it was about survival. The meeting with the capos was set for the following evening, and Rocco spent the rest of the day stewing in his office, strategizing. He had built his empire with a combination of fear, respect, and sheer willpower, but now it seemed that the foundations were cracking. The paranoia that had served him so well now threatened to tear everything apart. As the time for the meeting drew closer, Rocco found himself doubting his own decisions. Had he pushed too hard? Had he made too many enemies? The faces of his men swam in his mind, some loyal, some not, but all were now subjects of suspicion. The world he had built, brick by brick, now seemed fragile, like a house of cards waiting to collapse at the slightest touch. When the capos arrived the next evening, the air in the room was thick with tension. Rocco could feel the unease emanating from them, but he knew that he couldn't show any weakness. He stood at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the faces around him, each one a potential threat, each one a reminder that loyalty was a fleeting thing in the world he had created. "I've heard the whispers," Rocco said, his voice steady but cold. "And I've heard the talk. But let me be clear, no one is bigger than this family. No one. If there's a problem, we deal with it. If you're with me, you're with me. If you're not, you're out." The room was silent, the tension palpable. Rocco could feel the weight of their eyes on him, could hear the unsaid words hanging in the air. He had just drawn a line in the sand, and now it was up to his men to decide which side they would stand on. The meeting with the capos had not gone as Rocco had hoped. Though he had set a firm tone, making it clear that any signs of disloyalty would be met with swift action, the air in the room had remained thick with unspoken tension. As the men filtered out, Rocco could feel their eyes on him, some respectful, some calculating. But deep down, he sensed that things were no longer as they had been. Trust, which had always been his greatest asset, was now slipping through his fingers like sand. The following days were a blur. Rocco spent most of his time alone, wrestling with his thoughts, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. The empire he had built, the one he had fought for and bled for, was beginning to unravel, and he could feel it. The cracks were no longer just rumors or whispers, they were real, undeniable. His own men were starting to question him. His once steady hand was now shaken by doubt. In the quiet moments, Rocco often found himself thinking back to the days before he'd taken control of Atlantic City. He had been a rising star, sure of himself, confident in his ability to outmaneuver his rivals and take what he wanted. Back then, he had felt invincible, like nothing could touch him. But now, as he walked through the empty halls of his office, he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. His mind was a labyrinth of paranoia and fear. Every phone call was a potential trap, every visitor a threat in disguise. He began to question the loyalty of even his closest allies. The paranoia that had once been a tool to keep him sharp now consumed him entirely, blurring the line between what was real and what was imagined. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't think straight. And yet, he couldn't stop moving, couldn't stop trying to fix things. Every decision felt like it could be his last. It was during this time that a new figure entered Rocco's life, a man named Joey, the Ghost, Garibaldi. Joey was a quiet, reserved figure in the world of crime, a man who had built a reputation as someone who could make problems disappear without a trace. Rocco first heard of him through a mutual acquaintance, a low-level associate in the family who had once worked under Garibaldi in another city. The word was that Joey had a way of solving problems, but his methods were unconventional. He was ruthless, efficient, and always left no evidence behind. Rocco's initial instinct was to ignore the rumors. He didn't trust people who worked in the shadows, and Joey's quiet, methodical approach to crime felt like the opposite of what Rocco had built his empire on. But as his paranoia deepened and his network of trusted men began to shrink, he found himself reconsidering. Maybe, just maybe, Joey Garibaldi could help him regain control. One evening, after a long day of futile meetings and whispered conversations, Rocco finally decided to meet Joey in person. The meeting was set for an old, forgotten warehouse on the edge of town, a place where the air smelled of rust and dust. Rocco arrived, his mind swirling with questions. Who was this man, really? What did he want from him? And why was he so eager to work for the Bellarosa family? When Rocco entered the warehouse, he found Joey sitting alone at a wooden table, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. Joey's presence was unsettling, not because of his size or demeanor, but because of how effortlessly he exuded control. There was no bravado in his movements, no arrogance in his gaze. He was calm, collected, and in that calmness, Rocco sensed a danger that went beyond what he was used to. "Mr. Bellarosa," Joey said, his voice low and smooth. "It's an honor to meet you." Rocco nodded, taking a seat across from him. He didn't offer a handshake, there was no need for pleasantries. He had already heard the rumors, already understood that this man operated in a way that most others couldn't comprehend. "I've heard things about you, Garibaldi," Rocco said, his voice steady but filled with an underlying tension. "I've heard you get things done. But I also know that people like you don't work for free." Joey smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill down Rocco's spine. "I don't work for free, no," Joey replied. "But I don't work for everyone, either. I'm not interested in making a name for myself. I'm interested in solutions." Rocco studied Joey's face, trying to decipher his true intentions. "What's your price?" he asked, cutting straight to the point. Joey leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together as he thought for a moment. "You're losing control, Mr. Bellarosa," he said, his words blunt. "You're worried about betrayal, about men who are turning on you. But the problem isn't just that, they're starting to see weakness in you. And when a lion shows weakness, the hyenas gather." Rocco's grip on the table tightened. He didn't like being reminded of his vulnerabilities, especially by a stranger. But Joey's words cut through the fog of his paranoia with a sharpness that couldn't be ignored. "So, what do you propose?" Rocco asked, his voice low, his eyes narrowed. Joey's smile grew colder, more calculating. "You need someone who can fix things quietly. Someone who can deal with the men who are starting to question you. Someone who can clean up the mess before it spreads. I'm that person." Rocco studied Joey for a long moment, weighing his options. He didn't trust Joey, not yet. But he couldn't deny that the man's approach was tempting. If Joey could solve the problems Rocco was facing, eliminate the threats without leaving a trail, without drawing attention, then maybe he was the solution Rocco had been searching for. "I'll think about it," Rocco said after a long pause. "But I don't work with people I can't trust." "You're going to have to prove yourself first." Joey's expression didn't change. He simply nodded, as if he had expected that answer all along. "I understand. But remember, Mr. Bellarosa, time is running out. The longer you wait, the harder it will be to take back control." Rocco stood up, feeling the weight of Joey's words hanging in the air. As he left the warehouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a dangerous decision. Joey Garibaldi was a wild card, a man who played by his own rules, and that made him both an asset and a threat. But as Rocco got into his car and drove back to his office, he realized that his options were running thin. He had to act fast, and Joey's cold efficiency might be the very thing that could save him, or destroy him. Rocco spent the next few days in a haze, caught between the looming threat of his crumbling empire and the unsettling presence of Joey Garibaldi. He couldn't shake the images of the man from his mind, the calm, calculating way he spoke, the quiet confidence that radiated from him, as though he had already seen the outcome of every conversation before it even began. Rocco had built his entire life on control, on being the one who made the decisions, the one who held the power. But Joey was a different breed. He didn't need to dominate the room, he simply let the room bend to him. And that kind of power terrified Rocco. At night, Rocco found it increasingly difficult to sleep. His mind raced through the possibilities, each scenario more troubling than the last. He had always believed in his instincts, in the ability to read people, to understand their motives before they even spoke. But Joey was different. Rocco couldn't get a read on him, and that fact alone made him dangerous. The man was an enigma, and Rocco couldn't afford to ignore that. The family's operations were beginning to show signs of strain. The men were growing restless, whispering about the old days when Rocco was more decisive, more certain of his moves. They were starting to question his leadership, and Rocco couldn't ignore that. His paranoia had grown so consuming that every little change seemed like a betrayal, every shift in behavior a potential sign of disloyalty. He knew, deep down, that he couldn't continue like this. He couldn't keep living in this constant state of fear, unable to trust anyone, even those closest to him. It was on the 5th night after his meeting with Joey that Rocco decided to make a move. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. The decision had been made, Joey Garibaldi was going to be a part of his operation, for better or worse. Rocco had been avoiding it, hoping for a way out, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Joey's methods were exactly what he needed. The family's loyalty had become a fragile thing, and if Rocco didn't act now, it might snap beyond repair. The idea of using Joey as a tool to eliminate threats, those who were no longer loyal, became more and more appealing. The next morning, he called Tony, the Wolf, DeMarco into his office. Tony had been with him from the beginning, and Rocco trusted him more than anyone else, even if that trust had begun to feel like a thin thread. He had always been loyal, even when things were difficult, even when Rocco pushed him to the limit. Tony had earned his place in the inner circle, but now, Rocco wasn't sure where that loyalty stood. Was it still intact? Or had it begun to fray, just like the others? Tony entered the office with his usual grim expression, a man who had seen it all but still couldn't shake the weight of the job. He sat down without saying a word, waiting for Rocco to speak. "You've heard the rumors," Rocco began, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of his decision. "About Joey Garibaldi?" Tony nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yeah, I've heard of him. A ghost in the shadows, they say." Rocco leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "I'm bringing him in. He's going to help us clean things up. We have to tighten the reins, Tony. The family is slipping." Tony didn't speak immediately. He sat there, looking at Rocco with a mixture of concern and wariness. "You sure about this, Rocco? Garibaldi, he's not one of us. He's not from Philly. You can't just trust him." Rocco's jaw tightened. He had expected this. Tony was old school, a man who valued tradition and loyalty above all else. He didn't understand why Rocco had come to this decision, but Rocco wasn't interested in explanations anymore. He didn't have time for hesitation. "We don't have a choice," Rocco replied sharply. "The men are starting to question me, Tony. I can feel it. The loyalty's slipping. If I don't do something, we're going to lose it all." Tony's gaze softened, but there was still a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "I've been with you since the beginning, Rocco. You're my family. But Garibaldi, he's dangerous. I've seen the kind of men he works with. You won't be able to control him, not in the way you think." Rocco shook his head. He had heard all of Tony's concerns before. But things had changed. He had changed. The man who once took the world by force now found himself trapped in a game of shadows and whispers, and Joey Garibaldi was his only way out. "I'll handle him," Rocco said, though even as the words left his mouth, he wondered if he was telling the truth. "Just keep an eye on the men. Make sure they stay in line." Tony didn't respond immediately. He stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on Rocco. There was a moment of silence before he spoke, his voice quieter now, as if he were speaking more to himself than to Rocco. "I'll keep an eye on them, Rocco. But you need to be careful. Once you bring Garibaldi in, there's no going back." Rocco nodded, the weight of the decision settling in his chest. He knew Tony was right. Once Joey Garibaldi entered the picture, there would be no room for mistakes. The lines between friend and enemy would blur, and Rocco would have to rely on a man he barely knew to protect everything he had worked for. That night, Rocco called Joey once more, summoning him to a private meeting. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. The paranoia was suffocating, and the walls were closing in on him. He had to act before the family tore itself apart. When Joey arrived, his usual calm demeanor was replaced by something more deliberate, more calculated. He knew that Rocco had made his decision, and now there was no turning back. "You're in," Rocco said, getting straight to the point. "But you'll follow my rules. You'll work with my men. You'll do things my way. And if you step out of line, you'll answer to me." Joey nodded, his face unreadable. "I understand. But remember, Mr. Bellarosa, there's a cost to everything. You can't buy loyalty. You can only borrow it." Rocco didn't flinch. He had heard similar words from others over the years, men who thought they could manipulate him, control him. But Joey Garibaldi wasn't like the others. Rocco wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a bad thing, but at that moment, it didn't matter. His options were gone. He had no choice. "I know the cost," Rocco replied, his voice steady, though the uncertainty lingered beneath the surface. "But this is the price I have to pay to keep what's mine." As Joey Garibaldi walked out of the room, Rocco watched him go, a feeling of unease settling in his gut. He had made his decision, but now the consequences of that decision would begin to unfold. Rocco couldn't know it yet, but the man he had just brought into his inner circle would change the course of his life forever. The walls were closing in, and soon, there would be no way out. The tension in Rocco's life seemed to multiply with each passing day. As the weeks went by, Joey Garibaldi's presence in his operation became undeniable, but Rocco couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing a dangerous game. He had invited Joey in to solve problems, but what if Joey was the problem? The more Rocco interacted with him, the more he realized how much he didn't know. Garibaldi was like a shadow, moving silently through the corridors of power, leaving no trace of his intentions, yet always present, watching. Despite the discomfort he felt, Rocco couldn't ignore the results. Joey had quickly started working his magic, quietly eliminating the threats that had once loomed so large. Rivals within the family who had been questioning Rocco's leadership were suddenly gone, no bodies, no witnesses, just whispers of their disappearance. It was unsettling how cleanly Joey worked. Rocco had always preferred direct action, the force of power, but Joey's cold, detached method was beginning to feel like the only way forward. Still, Rocco couldn't shake the feeling that the more Joey did for him, the more he was giving up control. Joey was becoming indispensable, and that fact, more than any other, gnawed at Rocco's sense of security. There was something about Joey's quiet authority that made him uncomfortable. The man never needed to raise his voice or make grand gestures. His power was in his silence, in the way he moved through the world as though everything was just part of the plan, his plan. Rocco spent late nights at his desk, staring at the maps, the names, the faces of the men who made up his family. He'd begun to question who was truly loyal to him and who was merely loyal to the money, the power, the promise of safety. The lines had blurred, and the world he had once controlled with ease now seemed foreign to him. Joey's influence had seeped into everything, every decision, every conversation. Even the men who had once been closest to Rocco were now hesitant around him, unsure whether they were dealing with the same man they had sworn allegiance to. His thoughts were interrupted one evening when Tony, his oldest and most trusted friend, knocked on the door of his office. Rocco hadn't seen him in days, and there was something about the way Tony stood in the doorway that made Rocco's heart skip a beat. It was the look in Tony's eyes, a combination of concern and disappointment, that made Rocco feel the walls closing in once more. Rocco, we need to talk, Tony said, his voice quiet but urgent. Rocco gestured for him to come in, and Tony stepped inside, closing the door behind him. For a moment, the two men stood there, silent, as if weighing the gravity of the conversation that was about to unfold. Rocco could feel the tension building in the air between them. He had known Tony for years, and yet, this was a moment he had never imagined would come. "Sit down, Tony," Rocco said, his voice steady, though inside, a storm was brewing. "What's on your mind?" Tony sat, but his posture was tense. He didn't meet Rocco's eyes at first. Instead, he stared at the floor, his fingers tapping nervously on the armrest of the chair. "It's about Joey," Tony said finally, his voice low. Rocco felt his stomach tighten. He had been expecting this. Tony had never trusted Joey, not fully. Tony was the old guard, the man who believed in loyalty above all else, and Joey Garibaldi was everything Tony had always warned against, someone who operated outside of the family, someone who answered to no one but himself. "I know you've brought him in to fix things," Tony continued, his tone measured, but Rocco could hear the strain in his voice. "But this doesn't sit right with me, Rocco. The way he works. The way he moves through the family like he owns it. It's not how we do things. We're supposed to be a family, not a business." Rocco's jaw tightened at the words, but he held his ground. He had heard all of this before, but now it was different. Now, Tony wasn't just expressing his usual doubts. There was something more to it, a deeper fear that Rocco couldn't ignore. "I brought him in because things were slipping, Tony," Rocco said, his voice calm but laced with a hard edge. "I needed someone who could handle the mess. Joey's doing what needs to be done. He's cleaning up, and I'm getting results." Tony's eyes flicked to Rocco's, searching his face as though looking for any sign of hesitation. "But at what cost, Rocco? You're letting him do it his way, his cold way. He's isolating you. The rest of the family sees it. You think they don't know what's going on? They're starting to talk, and they're not happy." Rocco's heart began to race. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from Tony's mouth made it feel all too real. He had always been able to trust Tony's instincts, and the unease in his voice now spoke volumes. Tony was afraid, and if Tony was afraid, then the rest of the men must be too. "You think they'll turn on me?" Rocco asked, his voice a little sharper than he intended. Tony didn't answer right away. He looked at Rocco with something akin to pity in his eyes, then shook his head. "I don't know. But I do know this, if you keep going down this path with Garibaldi, you're going to lose everything. The men won't follow you forever, Rocco. They're starting to see that you're not the man you used to be. And I can't sit by and watch this happen." Rocco felt the weight of Tony's words sink in. The room felt smaller now, as though the walls were closing in on him from all sides. His trusted ally was telling him that his empire, his family, was on the brink of collapse. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that Tony was right. Joey Garibaldi wasn't just solving problems, he was creating new ones. Problems that Rocco wasn't sure he could control. "I'm not saying you have to get rid of Joey," Tony continued, his voice softer now, trying to ease the tension. "But you need to take a step back, Rocco. Look at what's happening. You're getting caught up in it all. And when the time comes, you're going to have to choose, your family or your empire." Rocco didn't reply. He couldn't. His mind was spinning, his thoughts scattered across 1,000 possibilities. Tony's words echoed in his ears, each one cutting deeper than the last. Family or empire? Loyalty or power? Could he have both, or had he already lost one for the other? The weight of the decision seemed to crush him, and for the first time in a long while, Rocco felt helpless. He had built his empire on strength, on trust, and on loyalty. But now, with Joey Garibaldi's shadow hanging over him, Rocco was beginning to see that those things were slipping away, and he wasn't sure he could hold on much longer. Tony's gaze softened, but there was nothing more he could say. He stood up and made his way to the door, pausing just before leaving. "You know where I stand, Rocco. I'm with you, but I can't watch you destroy everything we've built." As the door closed behind Tony, Rocco was left alone with his thoughts. He stared at the desk in front of him, the weight of the decisions bearing down on him with more force than he could bear. The walls felt like they were closing in. Rocco had always prided himself on being a man of action, of making the tough decisions before anyone else. But now, the road ahead was unclear, and every choice seemed to come with a price. As the night dragged on, Rocco sat in silence, his mind racing through the possibilities. He knew one thing for certain: nothing would be the same again. He had crossed a line, and the consequences would follow, whether he was ready or not. The days following his conversation with Tony were filled with uncertainty, but Rocco's decision was made. He couldn't afford to lose control. He couldn't afford to lose the family. But now, in the quiet solitude of his office, Rocco was beginning to realize just how thin the thread of power had become. He had brought Joey Garibaldi in to help him secure his place at the top, but Joey's presence had only magnified the fractures within the family. The more Joey took care of the business, the more Rocco felt himself slipping away from it. What had once been his empire, his kingdom, now felt foreign to him. As the months passed, Joey continued his work, seemingly without any real effort. He moved through the ranks of the family with a kind of effortless ease that made Rocco uneasy. There were no grand speeches, no elaborate displays of power. Garibaldi just did what needed to be done. He didn't ask questions, he didn't offer answers. He simply executed. And in many ways, that was exactly what Rocco needed. He could feel the weight of his empire getting heavier by the day, and Joey's cold, calculated efficiency was something Rocco had come to rely on. But as Rocco watched Joey's influence grow, he couldn't help but feel the distance between them. The man was always calm, always collected. He never seemed to show fear, never seemed to second-guess his actions. Joey was a man who was always 5 steps ahead, and for Rocco, that was both comforting and terrifying. He found himself asking, more and more, whether he was still the one in charge, or if he was merely a figurehead while Joey pulled the strings behind the scenes. The uneasy alliance between Rocco and Joey came to a head one evening when Rocco found himself sitting alone in his office, poring over the financial reports for the family's operations. He had always been meticulous about numbers, about ensuring that everything was in order. But as he scanned the papers before him, a particular figure caught his eye, a large sum of money, one that didn't seem to fit anywhere in the family's usual transactions. The number was far too large to be an oversight. Rocco felt his pulse quicken as he examined the report, turning the pages, checking the details again and again. The money, it seemed, had been funneled through a series of businesses connected to Joey Garibaldi. At first, Rocco tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a legitimate transaction. Maybe it was part of a bigger deal that Rocco hadn't been briefed on. But the more he thought about it, the more his paranoia began to take hold. He had trusted Joey, trusted him with everything. But trust, in this world, was a fragile thing. And if Joey was skimming from the family's money, it would be a betrayal Rocco couldn't forgive. That night, Rocco didn't sleep. His mind raced through 1,000 different scenarios. Was Joey playing him? Was this part of some bigger power grab? Was he trying to take control from within, to eliminate Rocco quietly while he remained oblivious? The thoughts gnawed at Rocco's mind until he could feel the edges of his sanity starting to fray. He needed answers, and he needed them now. The following morning, Rocco called Joey into his office. The man arrived with his usual calm demeanor, his face as unreadable as ever. He took a seat across from Rocco without a word, waiting for Rocco to speak. But Rocco wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. He didn't want small talk, he needed to know what was going on. "Joey," Rocco began, his voice sharp, cutting through the silence, "we need to talk about these numbers." He slid the financial report across the desk, the paper crinkling slightly as it came to a stop in front of Joey. "What's going on here?" Joey didn't flinch. His gaze dropped to the report, and then he looked back up at Rocco with that same impassive expression. "What's the issue, Mr. Bellarosa?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. Rocco leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You know damn well what the issue is. There's a large sum of money here that's unaccounted for. And I want to know where it's going." For a moment, there was silence. Joey didn't respond immediately, and Rocco felt the tension in the air, thick and heavy. It wasn't fear that Rocco felt, but something far worse, doubt. He had trusted this man with his empire, and now he was questioning whether that trust had been misplaced. Finally, Joey spoke, his voice steady and calm. "The money is being moved for a reason, Rocco. I'm taking care of things that you're not ready to see. It's for the family's future." Rocco's blood ran cold at the words. "For the family's future," he echoed, his voice dangerously low. "What the hell does that mean?" Joey leaned back in his chair, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "It means I'm looking at the bigger picture. You can't see it right now, but everything I'm doing is for our survival. You don't have the luxury of worrying about every detail, Rocco. You have to trust me." The word stung, but it was the calmness with which Joey spoke that unsettled Rocco the most. There was no urgency in his tone, no fear of being caught. Joey was speaking as though this was a foregone conclusion, as though Rocco had no choice but to trust him. "I don't trust you," Rocco said, his voice thick with frustration. "I trusted you with this family, Joey. And now I'm watching the men, my men, start to wonder if I'm still in charge. They're starting to talk. And you want me to trust you?" Joey didn't react to the accusation, but Rocco could see a flicker of something in his eyes, a momentary shift, like the glint of steel hidden beneath the surface. "You don't have a choice, Rocco," he said quietly. "Either you let me handle this, or you watch everything fall apart." Rocco sat back, his mind racing. Joey's words were a direct challenge to his authority. It wasn't just about the money, it was about control. And in that moment, Rocco realized that Joey wasn't just part of his empire anymore. Joey was slowly becoming the empire. The realization hit Rocco like a punch to the gut. He had known it was coming, but he had hoped, in his heart of hearts, that it wouldn't come to this. He had let Joey into his world, and now, Joey was slowly pushing him out. Rocco had been the king, but Joey was the one building the kingdom. For the first time in a long while, Rocco felt the bitter taste of helplessness on his tongue. He had trusted Joey, but now he was questioning whether that trust had been his greatest mistake. The thought was too much to bear. His mind scrambled for a solution, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't see a way out. The walls were closing in. Joey's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but firm. "I'm doing what needs to be done, Rocco. You'll see it in time." Rocco's gaze lingered on the man sitting across from him. Joey had become an enigma, a force he couldn't control. And for the first time in his life, Rocco wasn't sure if he could win this game. As Joey stood up and left the office, Rocco remained seated, staring at the door that had just closed behind him. The room felt colder now, emptier. Joey Garibaldi was no longer just a tool Rocco had used to secure his reign, he was a threat. And Rocco couldn't shake the feeling that, one day soon, he would have to face the consequences of letting him into his world. Rocco couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers. The days had become a blur, and his nights, once filled with the quiet certainty of a man in control, now stretched on endlessly, marked by the creeping sense of paranoia that had begun to gnaw at him. His mind had always been sharp, focused, but now, every decision felt like a step into the unknown. The more he tried to hold on to the threads of his power, the more they seemed to unravel. It was in moments like this, alone in his office, staring at the piles of paperwork that had always been his domain, that Rocco truly felt the weight of his choices. The numbers, the deals, the men, it had all been manageable once. But now, every movement, every glance, seemed to be laced with suspicion. Joey Garibaldi's influence had infiltrated everything, and Rocco found himself at the mercy of a man he no longer trusted. And yet, Joey's power had grown to such a degree that there was no denying the fact: the family, the operations, were thriving under his leadership. The business was more efficient than ever before, the money flowing in at a rate that Rocco hadn't seen in years. For someone who had once prided himself on knowing every detail of his empire, the fact that Joey had taken the reins with such cold efficiency was both unsettling and undeniable. The respect Rocco had once commanded was now in question. The men, once loyal to him through thick and thin, were starting to look elsewhere. Rocco could see it in their eyes, the whispers behind closed doors, the conversations that stopped when he entered a room. The respect he had once taken for granted had been replaced by something colder, more calculating. They no longer feared him the way they once did. They feared Joey. He couldn't ignore it. It was impossible to ignore. Everywhere Rocco went, he could feel the eyes on him, his men, his allies, his enemies. They all watched as he teetered on the edge of losing it all. And it wasn't just his empire that was at risk, it was his very identity. Rocco Bellarosa had built this family. He had been its heart, its leader. But now, it felt as though he was fading into the background, replaced by a man who spoke less and did more. A man who was always one step ahead, leaving Rocco to question whether he had ever truly been in control at all. The turning point came unexpectedly, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when Rocco received a phone call from a man he hadn't spoken to in months, Frank the Blade Falcone. Frank had once been one of Rocco's closest allies, a man who had helped him consolidate power in the early days. But somewhere along the way, Frank had distanced himself, pulling away from the family and the business. Rocco had always respected him, but Frank had his own views on how things should be run. His departure had been a quiet one, but it hadn't gone unnoticed. Rocco knew immediately that something was wrong when Frank's voice crackled through the receiver. There was no small talk, no pleasantries, just a sense of urgency, of danger. "Rocco," Frank's voice came through, low and urgent. "We need to talk. You've got a problem, and his name's Joey Garibaldi." Rocco felt a chill run down his spine. The last person he expected to hear from was Frank, and the last thing he wanted to hear was someone else voicing the same concerns he had been harboring for months. Joey was already a problem, but hearing it from Frank, the man who had been part of the old guard, felt like the confirmation Rocco had been dreading. "What are you talking about?" Rocco asked, trying to steady his voice. "Don't play dumb, Rocco," Frank replied sharply. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. Garibaldi is making moves, and you're too damn blind to see it. He's taking over, little by little. The men are with him, not you. And I'm not the only one who sees it. Hell, I'm not even the first to tell you." Rocco felt a knot form in his stomach. He had suspected as much, but hearing it out loud, hearing it from someone he had trusted, was a blow he hadn't prepared for. It was one thing to feel the walls closing in on him, but it was another to have someone else confirm that his fears were real. "I'm still in charge here, Frank," Rocco replied, the words coming out more defensively than he intended. "Joey's a part of this family. He's helping us. He's making sure the business runs smoothly." "Smoothly?" Frank scoffed. "You're deluding yourself, Rocco. He's running things his way, and if you don't wake up soon, you're gonna find out that you're not the boss anymore. You've given him everything, your power, your control, your men. You're a figurehead, Rocco. Nothing more." Rocco's grip on the phone tightened. The words stung, but they weren't a surprise. He had been feeling the same way for months, but hearing Frank say it so plainly made the reality all the more painful. "What do you want me to do, Frank?" Rocco asked, his voice quieter now, the anger subsiding into something else, something more akin to desperation. "Tell me what I'm supposed to do." "I'm not here to tell you what to do," Frank said, his voice softening just slightly. I'm telling you, though, you've got a choice to make. Either you take back control, or you let Garibaldi take everything from you. But you need to act now, or it'll be too late. Rocco stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of Frank's words sinking in. The decision was his, but it wasn't a simple one. How had he let things get so far? How had he let Joey gain so much power, so much influence, without ever realizing it? And more importantly, could he even take it back? Could he fight Joey and reclaim his position, or was he too far gone? You're not the only one who's been thinking about this, Frank, Rocco finally said, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. I know what needs to be done. You'll need help, Frank replied. And I'm not the only one who's willing to give it to you. But you've got to act fast. If Garibaldi gets wind of this, it'll be over for both of us. I'll handle it, Rocco said, the words coming out with a newfound determination. He knew that the time for action had come. He had to act swiftly, decisively. The empire he had built wasn't going to fall without a fight. Good luck, Rocco, Frank said before hanging up. The line went dead, but Rocco stood there for a long time, staring at the receiver in his hand. He was alone now, truly alone, and the road ahead was uncertain. But he knew one thing for sure, Joey Garibaldi was a threat, and he had to be stopped. Rocco didn't know how he was going to do it, but he knew it was time to take back what was his. The battle for his empire was about to begin. Rocco felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. For months, he had watched as the power he once commanded so effortlessly began to slip from his grasp. Joey Garibaldi's presence had grown from a useful tool into an omnipresent force, one that threatened to replace him entirely. The warnings from Frank, the Blade, Falcone rang in his ears, echoing the fears that had been festering in his mind for weeks. Rocco knew that he could no longer afford hesitation. Action was no longer optional, it was survival. He began to formulate a plan, methodically laying out the pieces on his desk as though they were chess pieces in a game only he could see. The men he trusted were fewer now, but their loyalty was unwavering. Tony, the wolf, DeMarco was still at his side, though Rocco sensed the worry in his eyes. The old lieutenant had seen enough to know that the stakes were higher than ever, and that any misstep could cost them everything. Together, they began to map out a course that would give Rocco the upper hand, that would reassert his authority over the family and remind everyone, including Joey, that the Bellarosa name still carried weight. The first step was to identify the weak links, those within the family whose allegiance was wavering or who had been swayed by Joey's quiet, unrelenting influence. Rocco pored over the intelligence he had gathered in recent months, cross-referencing loyalty reports, financial transactions, and even casual remarks overheard in bars and back rooms. It was painstaking work, but it was necessary. One misstep, one misjudgment, and his enemies would seize the opportunity to strike. The Bellarosa Empire, which had taken years to build, could crumble in a single night. Rocco's mind was sharp, but the pressure was immense. He realized that this wasn't just about taking down Joey, it was about reclaiming the respect and fear that had once defined his rule. The family needed to see that he was still in charge, that he was still capable of decisive action. The silence of his office, the low hum of the city outside, seemed to amplify the enormity of the task before him. Every decision carried consequences, and every action had the potential to change the balance of power forever. He decided to convene a secret meeting with his most trusted lieutenants, men who had been with him from the early days and who shared his vision for the family. The location was carefully chosen, a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of Philadelphia, far from prying eyes and ears. Only those who had proven their loyalty beyond question were invited. The air was thick with anticipation as Rocco prepared to address them, knowing that the path ahead required not just strategy, but absolute unity. When the men arrived, Rocco could see the mixture of loyalty and concern in their eyes. They had followed him through countless battles, both internal and external, and they knew that the empire was at a critical juncture. He addressed them calmly, deliberately, his voice steady but carrying the weight of authority that had once been unquestioned. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are at a turning point. There are forces within our family that seek to undermine everything we have built. We cannot allow that to happen. We must act decisively, and we must act now." His eyes swept across the room, locking briefly with each man in turn. "I need each of you to trust me, as you have always trusted me. We are going to reclaim what is rightfully ours, and we are going to ensure that no one forgets who leads this family." The men nodded, some more eagerly than others, but all with a sense of solemn understanding. Rocco knew that the plan required precision, patience, and an unwavering commitment to the ultimate goal. Any hesitation could be fatal. And in that moment, as he looked at the men who had sworn their loyalty to him, Rocco felt a surge of resolve. He was no longer the paranoid, isolated figure who had watched his empire slip away. He was a leader preparing to fight for his legacy. The first phase of the plan involved subtle maneuvers, quietly reasserting his influence over the family's operations, redistributing responsibilities to loyal lieutenants, and ensuring that the men closest to Joey remained under observation. Rocco understood that confrontation, if mishandled, could escalate into chaos. He needed information, leverage, and control. Joey may have been powerful, but he had not yet fully consolidated his position. There were cracks, and Rocco intended to exploit them. Over the next several days, Rocco moved methodically, making subtle changes that would gradually shift the balance of power back in his favor. Communications that had once flowed freely to Joey were rerouted through loyal men. Key decisions were made without his presence, but under his directive, ensuring that the family's operations remained stable while reinforcing his authority. Each move was calculated, each action deliberate. Rocco had learned over the years that power was not seized through brute force alone, it was maintained through intelligence, strategy, and the perception of control. Meanwhile, Rocco's relationship with Joey became increasingly tense. The man remained outwardly calm, never questioning Rocco directly, but Rocco could sense the subtle challenge in every interaction, the way Joey seemed to anticipate his moves, the quiet confidence that bordered on defiance. It was a test of wills, one that Rocco knew he had to win. The family's loyalty, the survival of his empire, depended on it. Despite the careful planning, Rocco knew that one mistake could undo everything. Every meeting, every conversation, every decision was a delicate balance. He found himself thinking constantly, analyzing patterns, reading between the lines of casual remarks. Paranoia, once a crippling force, had become a tool, a means to sharpen his instincts and anticipate threats before they materialized. The line between caution and obsession blurred, but Rocco understood that the stakes demanded nothing less. One night, as he sat alone in his office, reviewing the latest intelligence on Joey's movements, Rocco allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The empire he had built had not come easily, and the loyalty of the men around him had been tested time and again. But this challenge with Joey, was different. It was not just about power, or money, or influence. It was about legacy. It was about ensuring that the Bellarosa name remained synonymous with authority, respect, and fear. Everything he had fought for, everything he had sacrificed, depended on his ability to navigate this precarious moment with precision and resolve. The days turned into nights, and Rocco's planning continued in relentless cycles. He knew that Joey would not make a mistake willingly, and that the subtle shifts in loyalty he had initiated would take time to manifest. Patience, he realized, was as critical as decisiveness. Every move had to be measured, every risk carefully weighed. And yet, beneath the calculated exterior, Rocco felt the familiar thrill of the hunt, the rush that came from being the architect of his own destiny, even in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. As the first signs of his plan began to take effect, the redistribution of loyalty, the subtle undermining of Joey's influence, Rocco felt a cautious optimism. The empire was not yet lost. The family still responded to his authority, still looked to him for guidance. Joey, for all his skill and cunning, had underestimated one thing, the resolve of a man who had built his life on survival, who had faced betrayal, violence, and death, and who was determined to emerge victorious. Rocco Bellarosa was not finished. Not yet. Rocco's quiet confidence was beginning to pay off. The careful shifts he had orchestrated in his organization had started to show subtle but unmistakable signs of success. His most loyal men were once again operating with a renewed sense of purpose, and key figures who had once gravitated toward Joey were now beginning to question his leadership. Still, Rocco knew that the most dangerous stage of this battle had yet to come. He had placed his moves carefully, but it would only take one wrong step for everything to collapse. The tension between him and Joey Garibaldi was now palpable. In the weeks that followed his subtle reintegration of control, Rocco began noticing that Joey was growing increasingly aware of the shifts taking place in the family. There were the occasional glances, the strained conversations, the way Joey would linger just a moment too long after a meeting, as though searching for any hint of disloyalty or betrayal. But Joey, for all his cunning, was still too focused on his own ambition to recognize the full scale of what Rocco had been doing behind the scenes. Rocco, on the other hand, had been keeping a careful watch on every move Joey made. He had learned long ago that a successful leader didn't just control what was happening in his family, he controlled the narrative. He made sure his actions appeared to be small, insignificant shifts, just enough to keep things running smoothly while subtly regaining his position. The key to victory was never to force a confrontation before the time was right. And for Rocco, the right time had not yet arrived. At night, Rocco would sit in the dim light of his office, poring over reports, making calculations, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. His paranoia had become second nature now, a tool he used to his advantage. Even in the silence of the room, with only the distant hum of the city outside, he could sense the delicate balance that he was walking on. His mind never rested. Every piece of information, every whisper in the family's corridors, every movement of money and power, was carefully considered, analyzed, and stored. The quiet hum of the city outside his window became the backdrop to his growing sense of unease, as though the whole city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to arrive. One evening, as Rocco sat alone, his phone buzzed, an encrypted message from Tony, the Wolf DeMarco. Tony had been his right-hand man for years, a steady presence who knew how to read the room like no one else. If there was anyone in the family who shared Rocco's vision and suspicions about Joey, it was Tony. He trusted him implicitly, and Tony had never steered him wrong. But this message was different. It was short, cryptic. Rocco, something's off. Joey's making moves. Rocco felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. He had been expecting something like this, but to hear it from Tony, one of the last men he could trust, was a blow. Rocco had known that Joey would eventually catch on, but the reality of it hit harder than he had anticipated. The subtle war he had been waging had now escalated to the point of open hostility. There would be no more quiet shifts, no more strategic maneuvers. It was time to confront Joey head-on. The next day, Rocco called a meeting with Tony and a few others, men who had remained loyal to him despite the growing tension. The atmosphere in the room was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Rocco had always been a man who preferred to work behind the scenes, to maintain a sense of control without making overt displays of power. But the time for subtlety was over. Joey had made his move, and Rocco knew he had no choice but to respond in kind. "We can't keep pretending everything's fine," Rocco said, his voice steady but laced with the tension he was trying to keep in check. "Joey's not stupid. He knows we've been making moves. He's got spies, he's got informants. He knows something's up." Tony nodded gravely, his face reflecting the same concerns that Rocco had been grappling with for weeks. "I've been hearing whispers, Rocco. People are nervous. They don't know where this is going, but they feel it in the air. It's only a matter of time before Joey acts." The room fell silent, each man reflecting on the truth of Tony's words. Rocco had worked hard to maintain a sense of order, to keep things running smoothly, but Joey's growing ambition was like a storm gathering on the horizon. Rocco knew that his only option was to confront it head-on, to strike before Joey could take full control. "We need to force his hand," Rocco said finally, his voice low but firm. "We need to make sure Joey knows that this family belongs to me. That I'm still the boss." Tony and the others exchanged looks, the weight of the decision settling heavily on their shoulders. It wasn't a question of whether Rocco was capable of reclaiming control, he had proved that time and again. But it was a question of how far Joey was willing to push, and what kind of chaos would follow. Every decision from this point on carried enormous risks. "Do you think we're ready?" Tony asked. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of doubt to it. He knew as well as Rocco that this was no small undertaking. It wasn't just about taking down a rival, it was about preserving everything they had worked for. Rocco thought for a moment before responding. "No one's ever truly ready for this. But it's time. We've waited long enough. We're going to hit him where it hurts, the one thing he can't control." His eyes locked with Tony's, and the gravity of the situation hung between them like a thick fog. "We take out his finances. Without the money, he has nothing. No power, no influence. And once we do that, we show him that the Bellarosa name still holds more weight than anything he's built." The decision was made. Rocco knew the risks, but the plan was simple: target Joey's financial operations, the lifeblood of any mob empire. His connections to the legitimate businesses, his investments, the money flowing through various fronts, all of it would become Rocco's focus. Without money, Joey would be forced to confront the fact that he was not as untouchable as he thought. Over the next few days, Rocco and his men worked tirelessly to execute the plan. They moved quickly, taking advantage of every piece of intelligence they had gathered over the months. The moves were subtle at first, small, inconspicuous changes that would leave Joey unaware until it was too late. But Rocco knew that once the storm hit, there would be no going back. The tension continued to rise as the operation unfolded. Every night, Rocco would sit at his desk, reviewing the progress, tracking the movement of money, and ensuring that nothing had been overlooked. His mind raced, constantly seeking out new avenues for attack, new ways to destabilize Joey's empire. The paranoia, once a debilitating force, had become his ally. It kept him sharp, kept him alert to every possibility. And then, as the days passed, the first signs of success began to appear. Joey's financial empire, once secure and impenetrable, began to show cracks. Deals started to fall through. Accounts were frozen. Men who had once sworn loyalty to Joey began to distance themselves, sensing that his grip on the family was weakening. The storm that Rocco had been preparing for had finally begun. But even as he watched the pieces fall into place, Rocco knew that the final confrontation was drawing closer. Joey Garibaldi would not take this lying down. Rocco's actions had forced his hand, and now it was only a matter of time before Joey would retaliate. The balance of power had shifted, but the war was far from over. Rocco's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, the tension building with every passing moment. The game was no longer about subtlety. It was about survival, and Rocco Bellarosa was ready to fight with everything he had. Rocco sat in the dimly lit room, the flickering glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The plan he had carefully set into motion was reaching its critical point, and with each passing hour, the pressure mounted. He knew the time had come to act decisively. Joey Garibaldi, once a mere tool in his empire, had become the greatest threat to its survival. There was no more room for second-guessing. Rocco's men had executed the first phase of the plan with precision, but now the stakes were higher. Joey's financial empire, once robust and untouchable, had begun to crumble under the weight of Rocco's strategy. The subtle shifts had set off a chain reaction, and Joey was starting to feel the pressure. But Rocco understood that this moment, this opening, was fragile. The next move had to be flawless. Late that night, Rocco met with Tony and a few trusted lieutenants to finalize the next steps. The atmosphere was tense, thick with anticipation and the silent understanding that they were all in this together. Joey's reaction was inevitable, but the question was when and how he would strike back. "Joey won't take this lying down," Tony said, his voice low but steady. Rocco nodded, his mind racing. Joey would retaliate, but Rocco had prepared for this. The key was to stay one step ahead. "We move quickly," Rocco replied, his voice firm. "We strike now while he's distracted. We take everything he has left." As the meeting adjourned and the men dispersed into the night, Rocco's resolve solidified. The war had only just begun. And he would not lose. Rocco's plan had set into motion a series of calculated moves, but he knew the storm was closing in. Joey had become more erratic, his confidence slipping as his financial empire crumbled. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by a simmering frustration, the signs of desperation beginning to show. But even as Joey faltered, Rocco remained focused, knowing that his advantage lay in the silence before the inevitable confrontation. One evening, as Rocco sat alone in his office, the weight of the decisions he'd made started to settle over him. He had played the long game, but now there was no turning back. His men were loyal, but the uncertainty of what was to come had them on edge. Rocco understood their nerves. There were no guarantees in the world of organized crime, only calculated risks. Still, he was confident in the path he'd chosen. The groundwork had been laid, and the pieces were in place. What had started as a subtle war had now escalated into a full-scale conflict. In his heart, Rocco knew that the time for diplomacy was over. It was no longer a matter of quiet power moves, it was a battle for survival. And in the world he lived in, survival meant victory at all costs. The tension in the city had reached its breaking point. Every move felt calculated, every decision weighed with the knowledge that a single mistake could tip the scales in Joey's favor. Rocco's patience had worn thin, his resolve was tested with every passing day. The loss of Vito had ignited something primal within him. He had been ruthless in the past, but now there was a deep, personal anger that fueled his every action. Joey Garibaldi had crossed a line, and Rocco was prepared to make him regret it. As Rocco plotted his next move, word came that Joey had been making deals behind the scenes, trying to gain the upper hand. But Rocco knew that this would be Joey's final gamble. He had cornered himself, made too many enemies in his desperation. The circle of trust around him had thinned, and the cracks were starting to show. It was only a matter of time before Rocco would expose Joey for what he truly was, a man who had outlived his usefulness. The final confrontation was looming, and the stakes could not have been higher. Rocco's mind raced with strategies, each one more lethal than the last. The war for control had begun, and there would be no second chances. The night of the final confrontation arrived with an eerie stillness. Philadelphia, usually a city alive with noise, felt quieter than ever. It was as if the city itself was bracing for the inevitable clash. Rocco stood at the helm of his operation, surrounded by his men, the weight of the impending battle pressing down on him. There was no turning back now. This was the moment that would define him, win or lose, this fight would change everything. In the dead of night, they moved swiftly and silently, positioning themselves in and around the old warehouse on the outskirts of the city where Joey had made his stand. The tension was palpable, each man holding his breath, waiting for the signal to strike. Rocco had planned every detail, every move, but he knew that once the first shot was fired, there would be no predicting how the night would unfold. The air felt thick with the weight of the past, betrayals, broken promises, the long road that had led them here. Joey Garibaldi had been a force to be reckoned with, but tonight, it would all come to an end. Rocco could only hope that his preparation would be enough to outlast the storm that was about to break. The dust settled slowly after the chaos, the echo of gunshots lingering in the air. Rocco stood amidst the wreckage, his mind spinning as the weight of betrayal hit him like a wave. The final confrontation, the one he had meticulously planned, had ended not with victory, but with a brutal revelation. Joey Garibaldi was still standing, yes, but the real enemy had been closer to home all along. As Rocco surveyed the scene, the faces of his loyal men, those who had followed him for years, looked back at him with uncertainty. There were no words, only the unspoken truth: the empire Rocco had built, the empire he had fought for, was now teetering on the edge. This was not the end he had envisioned. It was a beginning of something far darker, a struggle not just for control, but for survival. In that moment, Rocco knew that his story wasn't over, far from it. But whether it would end in triumph or tragedy remained to be seen. The legacy of Rocco, the watchful, Bellarosa, was now in the hands of those who remained, and the streets of Philadelphia would whisper his name for years to come, a cautionary tale of ambition, power, and the price of betrayal.